Good. So, hello everybody. Start of a new series, but this one is actually really strongly connected to the last one. You don't have to have been to the last one to come, but if you did, hopefully there's going to be quite a nice bit of overlap. If you are here, could you just make sure to mute yourself, please? I will just mute a couple of people. There we go. I'm happy to do it for you if you're not quite sure how. Also, if you've not been before, there is the chat at the bottom, so you can participate in that, and you can minimize it if you don't want to see other people chatting. So today we're going to be talking about the dream, and I never saw a ghost except once in a dream, a history of the Gothic dreams. And below that you can see my Twitter handle and the hashtag if you want to live tweet, you want to contact me, feel free. So a couple of people got the idea from this that I was going to just talk about ghosts and dreams, but no. I use this quote for a couple of different reasons, partly because it's from a text I'd already looked at with you, which was Mary Shelley's On Ghosts. But partly because I'm not only going to talk about the connection between the ghost and the dream, but I am going to be concentrating on sort of supernatural understandings of the dream and theologized understandings of the dream. So what you'll quite often find in a lot of Gothic criticism, a lot of excellent Gothic criticism, just from a different sort of stream of critique as I do, is this real concentration on modern conceptions of the dream when looking at dreams as they appear in the Gothic period that is my period, the late 18th and sort of early to mid 19th century. And so you're looking at sort of psychoanalytic readings of the dream, and you're viewing the dream as a narrative device. But what I'm really interested in doing is engaging with the contemporary understanding of the dream and how it's reflected in the Gothic texts. And what I think we definitely find in Gothic texts is a real interaction with supernatural understandings of the dream. So I'm going to be looking at those today. So the first part of the session before the first break is going to be having a look at sort of an overview of how the Gothic and the dream intertwine, and sort of a brief history of dream belief. So it's very rough, it's very sort of condensed, because I could do 2 hours just on dream theory, and then another 2 hours just on a little bit more dream theory. So it's going to be quite condensed, but hopefully a sort of useful overview of sort of the early modern period up to the 19th century and what's going on and how dreams are understood. Because we bring with us automatically our modern understanding of the dream, and we need to sort of shake it off, because there was a very different understanding of the dream in that period, because this is obviously pre-Freud, pre-psychoanalysis, pre-understandings of the unconscious mind in most cases. So we're looking at something a bit different. I'm going to be investigating what those things are. In the second section, I'm going to be looking at some Gothic examples of supernatural dreams in some of my favourite fictions, and some of the sort of intricacy with which they're constructed, and the debates and ideas that they're engaging with. And then in the last part, I'm going to be looking at some sort of post 1800 works, and I'm going to be positing that there is a sort of shift in how dreams function in the Gothic in that period, towards a sort of more fantastic use of the dream. So if you've been to the previous classes, I've talked about the fantastic a lot. But the fantastic is that idea of a hesitation or a pause where you're stuck between two interpretations. Is it real? Is it not? So we're going to see how the fantastic and the dream really come into play in the 19th century. So that's a brief summary, what to expect. If you've got questions that you're already thinking, then keep them ready for the question times. And I'm going to start. I'm not going to start, as you might have expected, with the medieval period, as I usually do. No. I'm going to give a bit of a sort of intro to this connection of the Gothic and the dream, because there is this really strong connection between the Gothic and the dream right from the beginning. Because, as you'll know, many of you, if you've come before or just generally, one of the first Gothic texts was the Castle of Otranto, 1764. I'm not going to rehash the plot. Again, just if you've not read it, if you've not been here before, some highlights include, as we see in the background, somebody getting crushed by a helmet, a skeletal monk, somebody walking out of a painting, a castle getting destroyed, and everybody being sad at the end, although it's supposedly a happy ending. But what's interesting today is how this story was written, how this novel was written. And it could be slightly apocryphal, but what Horace Walpole says is the origin of this story is a dream. So this is from a letter that he wrote to his friend Cole. And he says, "I waked one morning in the beginning of last June from a dream, of which all I could recover was that I had thought myself in an ancient castle. A very natural dream for a head filled like mine with a Gothic story. And that on the upmost banister of a great staircase, I saw a gigantic hand in armour. In the evening, I sat down and began to write, without knowing in the least what I intended to say or relate. The work grew on my hands and I grew fond of it. In short, I was so engrossed with my tale, which I completed in less than 2 months, that one evening I wrote from the time I drank my tea, about 6 o'clock, till half an hour after 1 in the morning, and my hand and fingers were so weary that I could not hold the pen to finish the sentence, but left Matilda and Isabella talking in the middle of a paragraph." I can't even think really where that was, because they don't do a great deal of talking, do they, in the novel? But obviously, this really interesting connection of the Gothic with the dream, and this, it really underlines the oneric quality of the Gothic. So if you don't know the word oneric, which I didn't, and that could just be me until like a couple of years ago, oneric just refers to sort of the dreamlike, or of the dream, or of the same nature as the dream, nature of the Gothic. And I think Castle of Otranto, in a sense, makes a lot more sense if you think of it as a dream or dream-like. That sort of outside supernatural, those disjointed incidents, that sort of lack of logic that we find is all very oneric. It's like a dream or a nightmare. And you also have, as well as this idea of the Gothic as inherently somewhat oneric, exploring the world as if it were a dream or a nightmare. You also have this sort of connection here with a proto-romantic conception of the dream and the imagination. So one other way that the dream has been looked at in the Gothic is through this lens of the romantic reading and obsession almost with the dream. So in Romanticism, the dream and the fancy and imagination are connected with creativity and originality. And this sort of, it's this creative force which almost goes beyond our ability to control it. And you see certainly that idea coming through in Walpole's writing about himself, even though he's obviously predating Romanticism by quite some time. But this idea of a creative force from the dream, from his imagination, which outruns his physical self. You know, you can just imagine his little hand whizzing away across the page, can't you? How could you write for that long? I've forgotten how to write for that long. But what's quite interesting about this romantic conception of the dream is that we find it here, for example, in the Gothic authors' discussion of their own story, but you don't find it in the novel. You're not finding it in the characters. You're not finding it really in the portrayal of the dream as it appears in most Gothic literature. This is one of the areas where I think it's quite useful to make a distinction between Romanticism and Gothicism, or the Gothic in the period. Not a hard line, but a general trend. So you will also know that this is not by far not the only Gothic novel that purports to be related to a dream. But I thought I'd talk to you just one more, because it nicely finishes off our period, because I work from 1764 to the 1830s. And this, of course, is from the preface to the second edition of Frankenstein from 1831, in which Mary Shelley gives more of an idea of how she created the story. And you'll probably be aware of this, but I'll just go over it anyway, because it's always a fun little story. Basically, what happened in the creation of Frankenstein is obviously that it was part of this ghost storytelling competition at the Via Diodati between the Byrons and the Shelleys, between Byron, the Shelleys, and Polidori. And Mary Shelley was trying to write a ghost story, but broadly failing. Everybody was being quite smug about it, I imagine, and very like, oh, little woman. But then she details how the story of Frankenstein came to her. Basically, in a dream, when I placed my head on my pillow, I did not sleep, nor could I be said to think. My imagination, unbidden, possessed and guided me, gifting the successive images that arose in my mind with a vividness far beyond the usual bounds of reverie. I saw with shut eyes but acute mental vision. I saw the pale student of unhallowed arts kneeling beside the thing he had put together. I saw the hideous phantasm of a man stretched out, and then, on the workings of some powerful engine, show signs of life and stir with an uneasy, half-vital motion. And from there, she goes on to describe basically the rest of the story and how it came to her. There's a few things to note. We definitely have a very clear engagement with the romantic conception here of the dream and of imagination. She talks about the way in which her imagination is unbidden and it possessed and guided her. So she talks further in the preface about the way in which her writing has been stymied by the ways in which she is sort of writing from other people's work. She's influenced by her reading, and she had a very strict and rigid reading program that she went through. It's incredible if you look into it. But so breaking free from that, the only way to break free from that was through this dream, basically, which was a sort of original creative energy that comes out in her work, or that's how she's portraying it, that's how she's understanding it. And she goes on to describe how it informed her construction of the story, because she could not easily get rid of her hideous phantasm. It haunted me. I must try not to think of something else. I recurred to my ghost story, my tiresome, unlucky ghost story. Oh, if I could only contrive one which would frighten my reader as I myself had been frightened that night. Oh, I know. Swift as light and as cheering was the idea that broke in upon me. I have found it. What will terrify me will terrify others, and I need only describe the spectre which had haunted my midnight pillow. On the morrow, I announced that I had thought of a story. I began that day with the words, "It was on a dreary night of November," making only a transcript of the grim terrors of my waking dream. There's here a real sort of, I would argue, quite disingenuous disengagement from the idea of authorial work. She's suggesting that this is something that simply existed and was written down, with this massive emphasis on the imagination. And there's a whole big discussion here to be had about what she was doing and why she was talking about it in this way, and to what extent the truth merges with a particular narrative that she's also creating from the connection of her story to this dream. But there we have this quite clear connection of the Gothic with the dream in terms of creation, right from the beginning to the end of that early period. But I'm moving away from that conception now. These give you an example of what that romantic conception of the dream is quite usefully, but that's not what we're going to find in the text. Let me just give you a quick overview of the framework which I'm using in order to sort of think about how belief appears in Gothic texts and how belief manifests itself in fiction in this period. So quite a lot of work talks about this period, the late 18th and early 19th century, as a secularized or secularizing period. Now, I've always had problems with this because obviously I study religion, and what you're actually finding at the 18th century is the Church of England, the Anglican Church, is still extremely powerful and influential both in politics and daily life. You're seeing the proliferation of dissenting groups, including the Evangelical Revival, headed and spearheaded arguably by Methodists and Methodism. And then you're also seeing this proliferation of more spiritual churches, and then the rise of spiritualism, obviously, in the 19th century, and of rational dissent, such as the Unitarians, who came to the fore at the end of the 18th century. So that definition is never really fit for me. But one way of considering the secular, which I find really useful and helpful in considering this period and what's going on, is that that Charles Taylor articulates in The Secular Age, the broad strokes of it. So Charles Taylor takes sort of the common conceptions of what it means for something to be secular and moves away from them slightly. So he says that often when we talk about a secular state, for example, it's conceived of that there is no interrelation anymore of the church and state, that religion has been removed largely from the public sphere. So that can be part of it, but that's not a great definition. There's so much that it leaves out, so much that it misses. Then another common definition, and this is the one that I've always disagreed with, is this idea of a falling off of religious belief or practice, a sort of linear idea of we went from belief and credulity to science, and now we don't believe any of that, which is obviously not true because it's not true today. But what he suggests is a good way of thinking about secularity and secularization is that the shift to secularity consists, among other things, of a move from a society where belief in God is unchallenged and indeed unproblematic to one in which it is understood to be one option among others. And you can also put this in our context. The belief in the supernatural is unchallenged and indeed unproblematic to one in which it's understood to be one option among others. So what you have in the late 18th and early 19th century is this a condition where we can't help but be aware that there are a number of different construals, views which intelligent, reasonably undiluted people of goodwill can and do disagree on. So what we're going to find in the Gothic novels is the reflection of a wide variety of different ghost beliefs and arguments, some of which are much older than others, some of which have evolved and changed, some of which are being viewed critically. But there's not a sort of one understanding of the dream which you're going to be finding in the Gothic. And he's talking about the modern period now, when this last quote, but it's a useful application, I think, that there's an unheard of pluralism of outlooks, religious and non and anti-religious, in which the number of possible positions seems to be increasing without end. I think that's a useful frame. Like, think of the Gothic as representing all these different possible positions. And there are certain leanings, and I'll be pulling out some general trends today, but lots of different intersecting arguments. So Sasha Handley, who's a historian working on both dreams and the ghost, suggests that there's always a persistent fusion of natural and supernatural explanations. And I say that there are multiple discourses intersect, at times competing and at times coexisting in many early Gothic texts that tease out the reality, meaning, importance, and nature of the supernatural. The theological continues to be a primary interpretive framework. And I know that I always talk about theology, but this isn't just about theology. This is, in terms of the dream, I'm talking about a belief in the supernatural dream. So let's get into the history bit. I'm going to take you back to the medieval and early modern period, but a very whistle-stop tour for you. And this sense, the broad understanding of the dream of sleep in this period was of danger. So I've popped a couple of biblical quotes there for you. Gives you an idea of some of the things that we're going to be thinking about. So in Matthew 13:25, while men slept, his enemy came and sowed tares among the wheat. You see from a parable, but what you're going to keep finding is this sense of when man is sleeping, the devil is active. That the dream is a time of particular demonic influence. In Jeremiah, the heart is deceitful above all things and desperately wicked. Who can know it? And what we're going to find in a lot of this dream discourse is the concept that our dreams tell you a lot about yourself. And this isn't the same as psychoanalysis. This isn't about the repressed self. This isn't about sort of the unconscious. This is about, in your dreams, you are the sinful man that you truly are. The things that you've controlled and repressed with your reason and your will. Your reason and your will aren't active in your sleep. So you're just you, basically. So, as I say, super broad on the medieval here. Gabriel Klug, it tells us that, according to medieval theology, the need to sleep was a divine punishment for the fall of man, a daily reminder of mankind of their sinfulness, weakness, and imperfection. Nice. Therefore, sleep was seen in a rather negative light, representing ideas of remoteness from God, lost time, loss of control over body and soul, and absence of rational regulation. Now, don't worry, there's a lot of info in that quote. I'm going to be going over it in the next slide, bullet point by bullet point. So there's this idea of the sleep as a punishment. So sleep entering the world after the fall, and it's sort of a reminder of man's mortality, so that each night he quasi-dies, basically, and enters this space of the inactivity of the soul and the body, this space of annihilation. It's also connected, both through the fall and more obviously through the lack of sort of consciousness, to a remoteness from God, which leaves you open to more demonic attacks, of course. It's also connected, as I've already sort of mentioned with those biblical quotes, to the absence of self-regulation. So sleep and dreams are a time when you become dangerous to yourself, in that you could be dreaming of all sorts of things which function as a sin, to either tempt you into more sin or Much more polemical debate, you might be committing dream sin. Did you know you could do that? You can, possibly, depending on your theological outlook. So this is not in that Clue quote, but some other aspects that you'll find is this idea of sleep and spiritual unreadiness. So if you've read Hamlet, part of the sort of horror of that death for his father was that he died in his sleep, because there's this sense of in sleep is a bad time to die because you're unready. You might die unshriven, unconfessed. You're also in sleep particularly vulnerable to spiritual as well as physical attack. Spiritual attack from the devil, obviously. And there's also sort of metaphorically quite often in depictions of sleep and the dream, echoes of that idea of the sleep of the soul. So the sleep of the soul, as a sort of more metaphorical conception, is the idea of people being spiritually unready for the judgment day. That you'll be too late. You're sleeping up until you die, and then it's too late to wake up. And so that sort of gets tangled up back with the original metaphorical premise of sleep. So all of it's connected together. So sleep becomes a time of unreadiness, danger, and connected to this sense of being unready. And we see this sort of dangerous conception of sleep in Paradise Lost, for example. This is just a really useful example of a text from that early modern period. And what you find here is there's a bit of a contradiction, because we're in the Garden of Eden. So this is not, sorry, I've got such an itchy nose. This is not post fall, but this idea of you might not have noticed it when you read it, but this idea particularly of sleep as the time in which Eve was vulnerable to demonic temptation, and that dreaming, in fact, damned us all. So squat like a toad close at the ear of Eve, essaying by his devilish art to reach the organs of her fancy, and with them forge illusions as he list, phantasms and dreams. And it's this sort of access to her fancy, imagination, dreams that leads her to commit the sin. So just checking my computer's plugged in. So let's have a look at 16th century, very famous, early modern conception of the dream from Thomas Nash. If you've not read it, I have PDFs and I'm very happy to send them to everybody because it's amazing. You have to get used to the writing looking like that, of course, but it's great. And it's just completely off its tree most of the time. So we're seeing here a lot of repetition of what I've talked about as being the medieval sort of conception of the dream. So this is how he opens basically, and says, "When night in her rusty dungeon hath imprisoned our eyesight, and that we are shut separately in our chambers from resort, the devil keepeth his audit in our sin-guilty consciences. No sense but surrenders to our memory a true bill of parcels of his detestable impieties. The table of our heart is turned to an index of iniquities, and all our thoughts are nothing but text to condemn us." So there you go, dark stuff. He talks about the night as the devil's black book. So a couple of things to point out here. I've already done it with my boxes and arrows, but obvious emphasis on demonic influence and intervention in the dream. The idea here very particularly of, you've got this soul-body distinction that we've talked about before happening, but there's the concept here of the soul as entrapped, that we're entrapped in a sleeping sort of almost dead body while we're asleep, dreaming. And that there's no reason to control or manage us. And so it's just sort of the flesh that is outpouring itself into our dreams. The material of the dream comes from our sinful selves and our treacherous hearts. So let's go into it a bit more detail, because there's lots to it. It's not just dreams bad, demons. But that's pretty much the heart of it. Obviously, some of these points that I've already talked about, we see them proved here. So sleep as a punishment. So some divines have had this conceit or concept, whichever way you want to go with that God would have made all day and no night if he'd not been to put us in mind there is hell as well as heaven. This interesting idea in Nash, and we'll see it again in Tryon much more delicately, that sleep represents hell. Nightmares are hell, basically. I'll go back to that with Tryon. It's a really interesting idea. Obviously, the idea that the night is the devil's kingdom. And I love it, is this being proved that the devil is special predominant planet of the night, and that our creator for our punishment hath allotted it him as his peculiar seigneurial kingdom from his inveterate envy. I will amplify the ugly terrors of the night. Proved that the devil has control over everything at night. What is the devil doing in our dreams? Basically, for Thomas Nash, the conception is that the demon will always be dragging us towards despair. Keep that in mind. We'll see that in the monk. We're powerless to resist in sleep because of that sleep of reason and will. Demonic apparitions can appear in our dreams. Now, if you were at the ghost section and you remember the sort of the history of ghost development, that term apparitions might strike you, as well as the date. So 1594, we're talking that really very dogmatic post-Reformation conception that denials of illicit supernatural. So there are no ghosts, there are no spirits of the dead because there's no purgatory. So there's no way that the spirits could be free and wandering around outside of heaven or hell after they die. There's no augury, there's no Catholic miracles. So Thomas Nash has no belief in ghosts, but he does believe in apparitions and says that when we see ghosts, they're apparitions of the demonic, and these can appear in real life or they can appear in our dreams. Now, something that I wanted to point out is that even these early conceptions, they're not completely dominated by theology. So I don't want there to be this idea that there's this move from theological or supernatural understandings of the dream to scientific. These are scientific also, but just different science. His theory of the dream, and we'll find this with Thomas Trine as well, is controlled by the theory of humours, of which there are 4 main ones, and they can determine our personality or what rules us. So black bile creates melancholics, yellow bile cholerics, blood makes us sanguine, and phlegm makes you phlegmatic. And they are pretty much what you would understand by those words. There's a bit more depth to them, but we don't need to go into that much today. But what Thomas Nash says about dreams is that they're from the exhalations and vapors of what we eat and how our body functions entering our brain. And it's controlled by sort of excesses of usually, and this is why I put it in red, melancholy, which gives us these frenzied fancies and dreams. The dynamics of how it works, what appears in the dream. So he's quite engaged in moving away from a supernatural idea of the dream connected to sort of God intervening in the dream. He's willing for the devils, but he's in that post-Reformation period. He's trying to move away from kind of Catholic, trying to deny all those Catholic claims about dream witness, for example. And he's sticking to that cessation of miracles where all of this stuff just happened in the Bible. So for him, dream content comes from fancy, memory, and the concerns of the day. It is, in fact, nothing but the bubbling scum or froth of the fancy, which the day has left undigested, or an after feast made of the fragments of idle imaginations. So I love the way everything turns super dark with him straight away. I'm like, oh, it's memory and fancy, and he straight bubbling scum of fancy. Anyway, super cheery guy. He also, again, moving away from sort of supernatural interpretations of dreams in some ways, he says that the content of our dreams can be influenced by sound and stimuli from the outside world. So he's saying, it's not demons, it's probably a dog barking outside. If you're seeing demons, it might well just be a dog barking outside. Your dreams are influenced by external stimuli as well. Then he goes back to a theological conception. Good dreams are brief, the effervescence of joy after the troubles of the day, and only for a few. Normally, dreams are the evidence of our sin-guilty conscience, and an evil man begets evil dreams. He rejects dream symbolism, dreams as prophecy, and makes that biblical exception. So this is just the idea of the cessation of miracles, which was a popular doctrine after the Reformation, and as part of this kind of power war between the Catholics and the Protestants, with the Protestants saying, no, none of this modern miracle stuff is real. So all of your claims that you're backing up with miracles, that's not real. So we've had a look at that early modern period. Let's jump about 100 years later. Obviously, this is a whistle-stop tour, but we're moving to the end of the 17th century now, and you're going to see quite a paradigm change in how dreams are being considered. I'm using Thomas Trine's treatise in Dreams and Visions here, and this is an introduction. And he talks about, now is no wonder if a discourse of such sublime subjects as the entertainments of our souls during the body's nocturnal repose, where they, having shaken off for a time the fetters of the senses, are upon the wing in the suburbs of eternity, of the secret intercourses of spirits with humanity, and the wonderful communications of the divine goodness to his servants in dreams and visions. So I'm sure you can see quite clearly a paradigm shift, and we can definitely map this onto the stuff I talked about in the Ghost lecture about how belief changed. And you have that post-Reformation period, which is really anti-supernatural. And then moving into the 17th century, you have the threat of atheism, and this move again to accept and welcome a more optimistic conception of the supernatural, or an openness to its possibility. And you can see Thomas Tryon's work within that context quite easily, I think. But the main difference here is, so he's maintaining this idea of a soul and body distinction, but the emphasis is not on soul imprisonment anymore, but on soul freedom. So this isn't a sense that the soul is locked within sort of a dead body for a while. It's the body is at rest, and so the soul is free to wander about. And because it's pure spirit, this is the time when divine communication is most possible. And it's also like a ghost superhighway. So one of the sort of conceptions that we often have now is that the dream and the ghost are separate. And if we say, oh, you know, I saw him, but it was just a dream, that means that it wasn't real. But as you can see here, really the opposite was true for Tryon. Sasha Handley talks about this really interestingly, and the mix of sort of scientific advancements in theology at this period created a sense in which ghosts in dreams were more real than ghosts outside of dreams, because they were seen with the inner eye rather than the outer eye. And all of that work that was going on optics and light made sort of the visual ghost a lot more difficult to understand. But the internal ghost, the ghost that appears in your dreams when your soul is just communing with other souls and pure spirit, made a lot more sense. So how does Tryon chat about the dream? Well, much similarly for Nash, he has this theological conception, not psychoanalytical conception, that the dream reveals the inner self. It's the self that's been suppressed during the day. He also is using a theory of humours and vapours. So more broadly, the dream will reflect your constitution, your complexion, who you are in broad strokes, because it's reflecting your humours. It will also reflect the concerns of the day. How it functions for him is, he notes there are 5 external senses and 4 internal senses: common sense, fantasy, judgment or reason, and memory. And that during sleep, common sense and fantasy are active. So common sense is just the bit of you that keeps and organizes sensory data. Fantasy is imagination, fancy. Those are working. Judgment or reason is completely absent. Memory is patchy. And there's also this question of the 5th element, will, which I'll get onto more in a second with another writer, but this the problem of how will plays into these dreams we'll get back to. Now, as you might expect, as I've linked it to that sort of ghost story and the change in that period, the Via Media, etc., of how we're addressing the supernatural more broadly, the dream and sort of sleep activity is regarded once again as proof of the difference between body and soul, and as a proof of immortality and the immateriality of the soul, which keeps functioning even when our body is shut down. He also goes over in quite a lot of detail the question of interpretation. So we're moving away from Thomas Nash's denial, moving to that Via Media, trying to balance ourselves between sort of fanatical atheism, ignoring every dream and dismissing it as not being meaningful, and also superstitiously over-interpreting so that we make every dream meaningful. He's saying, like, some of them, it's just what you thought about during the day, but it could be something else. For him, and this is something that I've already said, but we see it very clearly in Clara Reeve, that dreams are connected to virtue. Good dreams are for the virtuous only, and they will remember their dreams better than bad people. Dreams, though, sad little end note after all that optimism, can be controlled by evil spirits. I told you that I would go back to this, but this is one of my favorite ideas of Nash's, that the nightmare prefigures hell, because a nightmare is basically an experience without the body of suffering, which prefigures what we will be after death when we've lost this physical body. So hell is basically a nightmare that simply refuses to end. So there you go. I'm just catching up with myself. I've not been keeping my paper copy of the slides up to date. So I'm not going to go much into Daniel Defoe because there's a lot of critical debate about the extent to which he was churning these out rather than believing them. But they're a useful representation of some of the beliefs of the period. And he's also talking about dreams and ghosts. So a little bit of extra backup, a bit more 18th century for what I'm saying about dreams and ghosts. But he also relies on a demonological interpretation. So he's also a good example of how these older views persist. He doesn't believe that there are any such thing as ghosts, spirits of the dead, but he does believe that there are apparitions, demonic and angelic. So he also thinks that there may be dreams without apparitions, there may be apparitions without dreams, but apparition in dream may be as well real as an apparition that appears to a person who saw it when he was awake. So an apparition as if the person who saw it was awake. So again, underline the idea that there's no difference between ghosts in dreams and out of them. He also mentions at the bottom there, and I won't read it out because it's fairly self-explanatory, but the apparitions and influences in the dream can come not only from the demonic, but also from the angelic, or even perhaps the divine. He doesn't think it's much of a good use of the divine's time, but he is willing to give the sort of angelic influence a nod. Again, just looking at the longevity of that connection of the ghost and the dream, we can go right into the 19th century for that quote that I used at the beginning from Mary Shelley: "I never saw a ghost except once in a dream." There's a fairly different conception here. She's exploring the dream as a liminal space between reality and imagination and memory. But also there's this sense of the possibility of the ghost, the possibility of that which is beyond material understanding occurring in the dream. I said I'd get back to the problem of will, and we find it discussed in another tract by Daniel Defoe. I say tract, it's an absolutely massive volume, The History of the Devil from 1726. The problem of will and consent in sleep. So I've used this picture of Carmilla, but using it to think about Christabel and Carmilla as very similar texts in which we talked about this for Vampire Week, you know, how there's a sense of that acceptance of the corruption of the vampiric in these texts. And it's quite a good sort of overlap and overview for how this idea of consent works in sleep. This idea of you're guilty if you don't say no, but if you don't consent, if you don't participate in sleep, then you're not guilty of what your dreams produce. So this is a super polemical issue in the 18th century, and I'm not going to go into all the arguments about it. But this idea that, so for example, if you have a sex dream, are you guilty of it or not? Well, you're guilty of it if you engage with it with pleasure and willingly and said yes. And so if you don't, then you're not guilty of sin, even though, you know, it could be a very lascivious demon naked dance or something. You're not guilty of anything then. Obviously, I'm talking about guilt in terms of the ethics of the time and not now. So this becomes a problem, particularly when you consider the secondary question of whether will can exist in sleep or not. It's all just very complicated, but worth just bearing in mind as a mini point. Don't get into the whole debate with yourselves. So I've done this little bit of a flowchart to give you a super brief summary. We've seen some of the changes there occurring, going from the early modern period into the 18th century, and some of what has remained. But we are going to see a very clear change in the medical consideration and understanding of the dream. So you have the vapors and humours that we've talked about, and then according to Sasha Hanley, we have what she terms the neurological turn, where you have the work, for example, of Thomas Willis, who in Cerebral Anatomy documented the physiology of the brain and the nervous system. And then in that second book, the neurophysiology of the brain. And William Cullen also famously working on the nervous system. So with this sort of neurological turn, you have this shift to emphasis on the importance of the brain and on the function of the brain, and a greater, but not obviously not perfected, because it's not perfected now, understanding, it's very basic understanding of brain functions. So you have this kind of shift in the scientific discourse behind dreams, and you do have a replacement narrative largely there. You also get this association with proto-psychological conceptions. So one of those is associationism, which we associate with John Locke, David Hartley, and in terms of how it's talked about with the dream, Joseph Priestley. So associationism, or association theory, is this idea that, so for example, you see something, a matchbox, for example, and it can create a number of associations with you, which give it meaning. And so with association theory and how that links with the dream is that we're no longer just dominated by the things that we've thought of that day, by the concerns of the day and the concerns of the current period, but our dreams can be triggered and can contain elements that are associated with things. So that's why we dream about things that seem to be completely unrelated to anything that's been going on in our lives. That this is the idea of how associationism crosses over with dreams. So Joseph Priestley says, we dream more often of those old associations which have momentarily flitted across our imagination, called into brief but vivid existence by some of the countless circumstances of the day. So, you know, it could be a sound that you heard, a scent that you smelt, something that you saw, and that can trigger a whole world that will appear in your dream. So they've said there's a proto-psychological theorization, and we find something like that, for example, in John Ferrier, who's one of the most secular of the works, secular in the sense of not using any faith paradigms. He does have a sort of get out of jail free clause in the introduction where he says, I'm not talking about the Bible because obviously prophetic dreams are possible if the scripture says so. But his whole work is about the idea that dreams themselves are hallucinations. They're the trick of a distempered mind. But what I want to make clear is that this scientific change and this development and sort of greater and more accurate understanding of the sort of science of dreams, so to speak, does not mean that there is a failure or removal of theological explanations. Once again, they continue to coexist and occasionally are symbiotic. So let's have a look at some of those theological survivals and why the dream remained really very clearly viewed through a supernatural lens well into the 19th century, and still today for some people. So there are biblical precedents and promises. It's easy enough to get rid of the ghost because there's only one biblical ghost, but dreams, not so much. They're literally everywhere. Dreams and visions. And there's also New Testament promises that the new church will, the young man will testify and the old man will prophesy and your young men will dream dreams. There's also the utility of the dream's place in the discourse on the immateriality and immortality of the soul. So there's this constant recurrence to how do we understand the dream and how does it connect to our souls? Dreams are the productions of souls. This continues to be a sort of argument that's happening. Obviously, there's continued emphasis on demonic influence, although how that influence works changes, obviously. Now it's not about just vapors, or it's not just about triggering the thoughts of the day. It can be much more subtle. There's also continues, and you'll find this in Gothic novels, this interest in an attempt to understand dreams that offer potential portents and this concept of prophetic dreams. There's also that continuing overlap between ghosts, demonic apparitions and visitations and dreams that are still investigated. One major part of this debate is the importance of interpretation and not hitting any of those negative interpretational marks, not being atheistic and godless and rejecting everything, not being superstitious and believing anything like, dream symbolism basically is one of the main examples of the time that keeps getting used, and not enthusiasm, because a lot of these enthusiastic sects like Swedenborg were completely based on dreams. And people were not about that. So that's the sort of also avoiding that enthusiastic belief that new revelation can appear in dreams. So avoiding superstition, enthusiasm, and atheism. So this is the last source that I'm going to look at in this section, because it's 1764, same year as Castle of Otranto. This is a translated text from the German that was sold in the UK. And for me, it's a great place to leave and think about the Gothic, because it offers a really good summary and intersection of how a lot of these debates were coexisting. So Reverend Salford denominates 3 types of dreams, although one of them has 2 subclauses, so that's really 4. But the natural dream, which he calls domestic dreams. So these are completely non-supernatural dreams. They are connected to the thoughts we had while awake. They're the productions of our minds, of what we've thought about, of what we've felt, of association. There are natural supernatural dreams. So he calls them natural dreams because they're not miraculous. They're not the result of a direct divine intervention. But I'm calling them natural supernatural because to our understanding, they're quite clearly supernatural. And there are 2 types: angelic dreams, which instruct us in what regards to our happiness and warns us against what might be detrimental thereto, and demonic dreams, where the devils can act upon us, excite dreams, continue or carry them on, and by them attempt our ruin, leading us into despair, into temptation in real life, or dream sin. This is one of the things that by this period in 1764, he was most critiqued for, this idea of dream sin, but still appears in the Gothic. And then there's the truly supernatural dream for Reverend Salford, the divine dream, which must be consistent with and explicable only by the power of the Creator. So we'll see what are the differences between these types of dreams. How do they manifest? And when we look at Radcliffe, we will definitely see how we find these different types of dreams being deliberately evoked. So the natural dream applies to all these things we've talked about before. Associationism, it's based on the thoughts we've had while awake, and it's usually things that it usually represents, with the dream rather than nightmare, a hoped for good. It's based on our wishes and wants and in our waking life. Nightmares represent fears regarding that hoped for good. So our terrors. But he notes that the natural dream will always be confused and disconnected. It's usually obscure, meaning that it's difficult to remember. And he says as well that it's not significant. It doesn't have any future meaning. It doesn't have any purpose per se. It's simply a reflection. For natural dreams, we are entirely personally responsible for them. So whatever their content is, it's our fault. So if we're going back to that idea of the will and the connection to the erotic dream, for example, if you lusteth after your neighbour's wife and have a sex dream about it, that's your fault, because that's coming from your thoughts. The natural supernatural dream, it could be based simply on our own thoughts, but will often be expanded slightly. So it could be an additional revelation. It could be extra information to act as a warning or a guide. Nightmares may be admonitory, so they're a warning, or they could be a torment leading to a sort of punishment, a form of punishment or damnation. And they're not just confused images, as a natural dream might be, but they have a discourse, they have a narrative, and they're what he calls lively. So they can be remembered, but they'll still be slightly disjointed in our remembrance. There is significance to these dreams. These dreams don't appear as purposeless. They have a purpose in themselves, and their end or purpose is happiness or misery for the dreamer. And that will manifest after the event. So one of the constant things in his work is this idea that the nature of the dream and how we interpret it will be verified by the event, by the result of the dream. And he notes that for these dreams, you have to accept it. You have to use your will to say yes, to be responsible for it. So going back to that Defoe point. And then the supernatural dream may be based on our own thoughts, but often will be expanded and may be a dream of completely absent objects. So what does he mean by absent objects? objects which have never existed in our minds. So, for example, a revelation of something that you couldn't possibly have known, the introduction of an image that you have never ever seen before. Nightmares will always be monetary or prophetic. Dreams will be lively, so they'll be easy to remember, and they will have rational, connected discourses. And they'll also be significant because they will reveal future things, they will give warnings, they will place you in the role of agent of providence, for example. And they are able to reveal the future fully. So this is a line that I put in, and we'll go back to the other two now. So in a supernatural dream, a divine dream, only God is omniscient and has complete knowledge of the future. So only a supernatural dream will fully reveal the future. A natural dream can reveal nothing about the future. And a supernatural dream, the demonic can only basically reveal his own guesswork. What can be guessed about the future from current circumstances. So if you are, for example, going skiing every day, I don't know, and you don't have much money, he can prophesy your ruin, that sort of thing. I don't know why I chose skiing. That was a weird one. Sorry about that. And then acceptance necessary, and then angelic. There can be some revelation of the future, but it will again be limited rather than the divine dream, which will give that full information in a lively, connected discourse. So as I've said, the big important thing for Salford is this conception that the dream will be verified by the events. And I'm going to be using this as a framework to look at Gothic texts. How we interpret or understand the dream will only be found out when it's fully played itself out, when we see, have we fallen into temptation? Has the prophecy come true? Has the warning been relevant? If not, we should be suspicious of the dreams. And he mentions, particularly for him, that we should avoid superstition and godlessness. Superstition is the first bypath into which the bulk of mankind precipitately hurry to the destroying of their own happiness by false interpretation of dreams and to the obstructing their own peace of mind. So we shouldn't rush into interpreting, but we should also be wary of saying that it can't mean anything. Godlessness, some of those who would avoid superstition on the one hand are betrayed into a bypath on the other and reject all dreams as insignificant sallies of our imagination. So wake up, guys. It's question time. So, does anybody have any questions? Ghosts are illegal. Do feel free to ask anything. I hope that was a relatively fun overview for you of the dream, or relatively interesting at least. Pasmodrin Bashir.
Hello, can I ask a question?
Of course.
I thought you'd say that. Yeah. First of all, very fascinating. I found all of that very new and very interesting. I just wondered if people viewed women as more susceptible back in the day to the influences of the demonic ones, and they were, because they were weaker and more pathetic and, you know, couldn't deal with it. And I wonder if that's reflected in Gothic stories, being so pathetic and useless.
Well, it's interesting. Like, definitely women were considered more susceptible because they were considered as having a weaker or non-existent reason. So reason, in terms of that division of the mind that you saw in Thomas Tryon, was considered to be sort of one of the mainstays of sort of self-regulation, which would help you control demonic influence, etc. So women were, yes, considered to be more susceptible, both to demonic and divine influence, though. So you do have that sort of opposition, particularly in the 17th century. You get a lot of women prophets and in parts of different dissenting movements, which is quite interesting. But in Gothic texts, you get a mix. There are quite a lot of very superstitious dreaming men in the Gothic, and men who make an absolute mullock of it, and women who get it right because of being more spiritually sensitive. And so, I mean, you could put that into this changing discourse, perhaps within sensibility, and this emphasis on the value of emotion and of sort of emotional emotional intelligence, not as we understand it today, but a form of intelligence which is emotion based, basically, or is just emotion, which women were seen as having more access to. So there's perhaps a sort of switch in the discourse, but I think it probably depends on the author as well. Like, a lot of women authors are depicting stupid men who get to see.
Wonder why. Is it because women are seen more as innocent, childlike, so they can be more in tune with nature and all that kind of thing, because they're not influenced by the scientific tricky stuff?
I mean, there's these kind of cross purposes of debate, or sort of different channels of debate, because in the 17th century, women were seen as less innocent and more corrupt, more controlled by the passionate nature and the sinful self, more driven by their bodies than men. So there's like a complete flippity floppity for our modern day, and that sort of this discourse now, like, a man who couldn't control himself, that sort of garbage discourse we have now. In the past was like, well, she's a woman, she just couldn't help herself. Yeah. Quite a different sort of way of thinking about it. But then, of course, you get after the Rousseau and his like awful childlike pastoral innocence thing. Yes, you get that sort of different conception of why women might have different forms of access to spiritual intervention. Let's have a look. Question. I know this is film rather than literature. Do you think more modern media like A Nightmare on Elm Street are tapping into these Gothic concepts around dreams? I mean, so like one thing that, you know, I always say is that my work is very historically based. So I'm looking at the way that these discourses intersect and appear in the time period. But that's not to say that they haven't influenced later sort of depictions of the dream, particularly within the genre, because you get genre tropes building up, which become disconnected perhaps from that original ideological context, but still echo it, if that makes sense, because they were originally written within that context, so they continue to produce it. But I think by the time you're getting into sort of modern filmic conceptions, you're getting a much stronger influence, arguably, from some of the romantic reconception of the dream, imagination and creativity. I think you're getting, you know, a really strong mix of our modern conceptions of the dream and how they function and how they work. So I think it's useful to look at the origins of Gothic tropes and Gothic texts in terms of what books are doing now, what films are doing now, what texts generally are doing now. But I don't ever want to say that you should use this paradigm to look at that film, if that makes sense, because it's being written in a very different set of circumstances and beliefs. I hope that answered the question. Oh, hello, Rishika.
Sorry, can I ask, how much does the fact of Eve and the original sin kind of influence the 17th century, as you mentioned, women being more, I don't know, more sinful than men?
Oh yeah, it's all about Eve. It's all about Eve. It's about sort of this conception of women as the route through which sin enters the world because of their sort of the way in which they're dominated by their bodies. And it's also sort of connected to the original sin, but connected as well to the curse. Because the curse that came out of the Garden of Eden is in part that Eve would be sort of subservient and devoted to her husband. So there were particular readings of that as women being more devoted to the flesh and fleshly relations. So yeah, there's a lot of overlap. Obviously, we think about kind of monstrous female figures now as more connected with Lilith, and that's certainly true. But there was this, you get a reimagining that has to happen of Eve, and you do get a reimagining of Eve, particularly in the Romantic period with the sort of early feminist writers like Mary Wollstonecraft. But that reimagining has to happen because prior to that, Eve made women not monstrous, but weak, if that makes sense, weak or more liable to sin, or more liable to, not to sin, but to a particular sort of strand of sin, and particularly to their a very tight and dangerous connection with their own bodies. You know, like they were very, like women were far less able to escape into the cerebral world. It sort of was the conception. I hope that answers the question. Do feel free to add to it if you want in the chat. Michelle, contrast with sleep as the mind's balm in Macbeth, but you couldn't guarantee a dreamless sleep, so it could be medicinal or could be perilous to the soul. Yeah, I mean, Macbeth's really interesting because if you know, on the period where it's written, you're starting to see, well, you've always got different conceptions of the dream occurring, but you've definitely got that sort of the mix of the positive and the negative conception of the dream clashing slightly. But I mean, that sort of medieval conception of the dream as punishment wasn't as prevalent already by the time of Thomas Nash. Thomas Nash he's not an outlier, but he's certainly very far in one direction. I never realized there was a connection between dangerous dreams and Eve, but that's so interesting, particularly since I think I read something about Lilith functioning as a scapegoat for cot deaths and men having impure dreams at some point. Yes. Yeah, she was associated with the production of dreams, whereas Eve was associated with the sort of consumption of dreams. That's not the right word, but you know what I mean, dreaming. But not like, I mean, that conception in Paradise Lost of Eve and her dream isn't, you know, the biblical narrative, obviously, but I think there's a really interesting way in which it reflects that particular conception of the dream as a point of access for evil. And then obviously that idea of Eve's dream, because of the influence of Paradise Lost, becomes then a staple. How concerned were people of the period about incubi and succubi, as in Fuseli's The Nightmare? That was the late 1700s, so maybe a bit later. Yeah, so I'm not an expert in the Fuseli, and I say that because I went to a conference which was literally just on dreams in my period of time, so beautiful. And there were quite a few experts on Fuseli, so like I'm very wary about talking about it because I know what can be known, and I know that I don't know it, basically. But there is going to be out, if it's something that interests you, keep an eye out. I can't remember what it's called, but there's a book coming out, I think January 2021, that is going to be all about different historical conceptions of the dream in the late 18th century. I'm doing the theology chapter, but there's going to be loads of stuff, including stuff about like incubi and succubi, and also sort of that medical discourse of sleep paralysis, etc., that was becoming more explored in that Romantic period. I think that sort of conception of incubi and succubi per se had become more folkloric and was in that sort of category of sort of Catholic belief forms. Not that it is a standard Catholic belief, but that sort of a post-Reformation rejection of a particular set of beliefs. So formally, there was no particular conception of incubi and succubi. There wasn't a dominant discourse about it particularly. But you do get it as an image that's used, and you do get a sort of allegorization of the incubi and succubi more broadly. Like you find with the Fuseli, and like the dream and sleep paralysis and the nightmare were really common subjects in that specific period. And you get quite a lot of different depictions of the dream, which are sort of allegorized to represent all sorts of different things, which is quite interesting. But as I say, I'm not the person that knows the most about it. There's definitely good work out there. I'll see if I can dig some up, because I'm saying this is in like, I know there's so much on it, you know, that I'm only scratching the surface. Yeah. I mean, you know, like when I say sort of folkloric, when I'm talking about the discourse, I'm really talking about the discourse in written sources and that sort of higher level discourse, but not really engaging with all the details of the folk belief that coexisted at the time, which definitely, you know, were widespread and offers a lot sort of broader target for investigation. The same with ghosts, you know, like there's a much richer series of folk beliefs about the supernatural than there are that kind of dominated in educated literature or educated circles. So yeah. And I mean, you do get that sort of in the Gothic, and particularly the Romantic Gothic or the Romanticism Gothic overlap. You have that interest in folklore. So Yeah. Yeah, I'm not sure. I would be interested in seeing sort of more examples, really, of Gothic texts that use that folkloric, these folkloric elements, because I'm sure there are plenty, but I just haven't really seen them. Okay, any more questions? Or I'll go on to part 2, which is much shorter, I think. It was when I practiced it this morning, just before I came on. Okay, I'm going to go for it. Awesome sauce. I hope that you're appreciating my gifts today. They get worse. So what I'm going to be doing in this section is just looking at some of the supernatural dreams that occur in the Gothic. And I'm going to be investigating these dreams through that lens of all of these different dream beliefs that existed, and pointing out the way that we have survivals that are occurring in these dreams, and that we have very specific beliefs being portrayed. Because quite often when I read criticism of dreams in Gothic criticism, there's not necessarily that engagement with all of these differences in the way that they're depicting very different forms of dreams and very different understandings of the dreams, and with it very different understandings, and I'm not going to go into that today so I don't bore you all, very different understandings of things like providence and the miraculous and the relationship of body and soul and determinism and sin and all sorts of things. Anywho, I'm going to take you back to Clara Reeve and the Old English Baron from 1778, which is some of our earliest Gothic dreams. Now, Sasha Handley, bizarrely, because she is such an expert on the dream, I don't know why she says this. Edmund's vision may have been little more than a wishful reverie as it occurred in a dream. Well, no, it wasn't a reverie. There's no hint that it wasn't real, I don't think. And there's a lot of evidence that it was supernatural. Something that perhaps I could agree with is this idea by Clary that the use of dreams as omens is designed to protect the feelings of the reader from being too violently aroused. So you do have this sense that in what's her face? Oh my gosh, Clara Reeve. Like I've talked about before, in her introduction, she gives this introduction saying, you know, I'm moving away from the excessive supernatural of Horace Walpole, and I'm putting it within the bounds of possibility. And so there's this perhaps idea that the dream produces that bounds of possibility. But also, why does it? We have to go back to the idea that I think of, for example, the ghost appearing in the dream, and what we talked about with Thomas Tryon, this idea that actually it's more likely and more believable if we understand the ghost appearing in the dream to the spiritual eye. But it can appear as a sort of, the dream can appear as a sort of supernatural light to pop in your Gothic novel. So let's have a look at the dreams in this text. There are a couple. We often focus on the dream of the main sort of character-ish, Edmund, who's the one who has been usurped, and we all think he's a servant, but he's not really. He's the prince, well, the lord. But there's also, right at the beginning, Sir Philip, who is actually arguably the character who gets most screen time, is this dream that he has. So he's returned from the wars, and he's sort of thinking to see his old friend Walter Lovell. He's looking for him, but before he gets to his house, he has this dream where he sees him and he beckons him into the castle, beckons him to follow him and led him through many rooms till at last he sunk down, and Sir Philip thought he still followed him till he came into a dark and frightful cave where he disappeared, and in his stead he beheld a complete suit of armour stained with blood, which belonged to his friend, and he thought he heard dismal groans from beneath. Presently after, he thought he was hurried away by an invisible hand and led into a wild heath, where the people were enclosing the ground and making preparation for 2 combatants. The trumpet sounded, and a voice called out still louder, "Forbear! It is not permitted to be revealed till the time is ripe." So here you have a really interesting dream which fulfills a number of functions. It provides information that he's not aware of, so it hints at the death of his friend. And it also provides a future prophecy about what will happen. And in the end of the dream, he does defend the hero, I suppose, or his rights by entering into a duel with the main baddie. So this functions as a prophecy. It also it raises a number of questions. So is this a prophetic dream with an angelic spirit disguised as Walter Lovell to pass on the information? Is it Walter Lovell appearing in the dream? Who can say? We also have this question, which I think is quite interesting, about free will. I'm just going to mention it briefly, just because it's a good one for this text, where it says, an invisible hand. He was hurried by an invisible hand. So there's this sense of his lack of control over his own destiny. He's becoming a tool of providence. And this dream is his sort of warning in advance. But it's a bit debatable. I don't think that we should read it so negatively. Because I think what we find here is actually the potential being offered to willingly become an agent of divine justice, something which he's very pleased to do. But we also have here, I think, the sense of comfort. So he's about to find out his friend's been murdered and dead for years, but there is a comfort being offered of the possibility of justice. Now, Edmund's dream, not Edward, sorry about that. His parents appear at his bedside, though he doesn't recognize them because he's never met them, because they died when he was a baby. So this is the more famous of the two dreams. And they appear at his bedside and they have this little discussion. Is this our son? Yes, I think it is our son. Oh, how lovely. He's the hope of our house. So there's perhaps a stronger hint here that these really are his parents rather than angels, because they're enacting this sort of mum dialogue. There's a prophecy that he'll restore the house. There's a revelation, as for Sir Philip, of their fates, because he follows the ghosts in his dream to sort of a funeral cortege. And then there's a future prophecy of prosperity and love. I spelled prophecy wrong. I spelled prophecy wrong, sorry. Not a good slide. But he sees himself sat at the table with his beloved and sort of ruling over the house. So there's, again, offering a future idea here. So a future prophecy. And it says that every succeeding idea was happiness without alloy, and his mind was not idle a moment till the morning sun awakened him. He perfectly remembered his dreams. There's a couple of things I want to bring out here that make it very clear that these are considered either angelic or divine dreams. And also an interaction with the idea that we talked about with Thomas Tryon, that dreams, good dreams, are a reward for the good. So there's a really interesting emphasis here on the fact that he then had a load of good dreams. So it's foregrounding his virtue and his virtuous claim and his worth by giving him good dreams. So I think there's quite an interesting bit of coding there that you might miss if you're not aware of how dreams are considered. And this idea that he perfectly remembered his dreams again points to the angelic, or more properly the divine dream. So moving on from that example, with these fairly clear issues of the ghost appearing in the dream, prophecy, warning, the revelation of knowledge, I'm going to move on to the example from Anne Radcliffe. And we're looking at a different issue here. So something that Anne Radcliffe is emphasizing is the importance of the question of interpretation. So this is always, for me, the main issue when Radcliffe approaches or depicts the potentially supernatural. In her story, the main character is called Adeline, if you've not read it, and we meet her sort of a victim of, well, we don't know what's going on, but she is sort of cowed and trembling in the house of a group of robbers that Lamotte has been brought to as he's escaping Paris for debt. And Lamotte and his family are fleeing Paris for debt. And they just sort of give Adeline to Lamotte, and he doesn't know why or what's going on, but he's a bit of a coward, so he just says okay and takes her with him. Eventually they set up shop in an abbey, an abandoned abbey, but it belongs to the Marquis de Montalt, and he is interested in Adeline sexually. But then it turns out that he's her uncle and none of them knew. And it also turns out that he killed her dad in that very ruined abbey. What? Oh, so twisty. That's Providence for you. It makes everything come together. But as part of the sort of action of Providence, Adeline has 4 very clearly supernatural dreams. So we often talk about Radcliffe as not having any supernatural in her. She does. She very clearly does. And we can see it in these dreams. So have a quick read with me there of the first dream. So this first dream occurs when she's still in the cottage right at the beginning, being held by robbers or whatever they are. She says, "At length I lay down to sleep, but the anxiety of my mind prevented repose. Gloomy, unpleasing images flitted through my fancy, and I fell into a sort of waking dream. I thought that I was in a lonely forest with my father. His looks were severe, and his gestures menacing. He upbraided me for leaving the convent, and while he spoke, drew from his pocket a mirror, which he held before my face. I looked in it and saw, my blood now thrills as I repeat it, I saw myself wounded and bleeding profusely. Then I thought myself in the house again, and suddenly heard these words in accents so distinct that for some time after I awoke, I could scarcely believe them ideal. Depart this house. Destruction hovers here." So if you just had this one dream in isolation, it would be a lot more questionable whether it is a supernatural dream. It appears to reflect her own anxieties about the period and her own internal recognition that she needs to get out of Dodge. But when we put it in the context of the subsequent dreams, it becomes clear that it is one of a number of supernatural dreams. So when she is in the ruined abbey, she has 3 dreams in a row. In the first, she's in a chamber that she's never seen before. And in it, she sees a sick man. She attempts communication with him, but he starts to sort of sink through the floor. So she wakes up in terror. But she can't stop herself falling into the next dream. In this dream, she's still in the abbey, but in a different part. And she's wandering the corridors where a figure appears in the distance, a cloaked figure, and she follows the figure. And there's perhaps a sense that it might be the figure from the first dream, but then it clearly becomes evident that it's not. And she's chased by the figure and wakes in terror. But once again, she can't help falling back into her dream. She follows once again the man from dream 3, and he leads her to a room where there is a coffin with the man from dream 2. He's wounded in his side. He's been hit by a dagger blow and he's bleeding profusely. And she hears a voice speaking in the voice she heard before, so presumably the voice from the first dream, as there's been no other voices, that told her sort of part of the meaning of the dream. And so what we actually have here, what happens, is her father's fate is being revealed to her. She's also being shown some absent objects, a chamber that she's never seen, a man she's never seen, and a dagger that she's never seen, all of which she will find out about later. And this dream sort of instigates her quest, through which she finds the rusted dagger and the narrative which tells her of her father's imprisonment and eventual murder. So are the dreams supernatural? Well, quite clearly, yes. Partly because they offer a prophecy, partly because they offer information that she had no access to, and they feature absent objects that she's never seen. But also, if we think back to those categories by Saalfeld, they very clearly follow the pattern of divine or angelic dreams. So they're connected, they're clear, they present unknown and unknowable information, they concentrate on absent objects, and they offer a future warning. They're also very clearly portrayed as being themselves agents of providence and making out of Adeline an agent of providence as well. So she was suffered to live as an instrument to punish the murderer of her father. That's what I've always wanted for my life. So I've said already that the question of interpretation is really key. And in her previous novel, A Sicilian Romance, Radcliffe had asked the question. And there's a very long passage with a character called Madame Menon where she talks about how you can interpret possibly supernatural occurrences and how to do it. And then Adeline models for us the perfect way to deal with a dream. So Saalfeld has told us what we need to do. God might instruct us in our dreams. Our will and our understanding, our passions are asleep. And it may teach us. So we have to duly consider, calmly, and without precipitation pass a judgment, usually after verification from the event, in his phrasing. What does Adeline do? The longer she considered these dreams, the more she was surprised. They were terrible, returned so often and seemed to be so connected with each other that she could scarcely think them accidental. Yet why they should be supernatural she could not tell. So she takes the exact correct path, opens herself to the possibility, considers but makes no precipitate judgment before they're verified by the event. But at the end of the story, she's the one who says, I have been suffered to live as an instrument of my father's murder. So she recognizes the supernatural nature later. So let's move into something a bit more interesting than divine dreams, demonic dreams. And there are lots of them in the Gothic, but particularly in the later period. So when you're moving into that sort of horror Gothic, you're finding these dark demonic dreams. Now we have them in Zofloya. So in Zofloya, Victoria, we remember, is the sort of femme fatale character who's on this slippery path of vice. She's married when the dreams happen to a man called Berenza, who she cordially hates, because it's all very complicated. He slept with her before marriage, and she thought it was because he thought they were equals, but he thought it was because she wasn't really good enough. Then she saved his life and he married her, and she suddenly realized what his thinking had been, and since then she hated him. She's now in love with his brother, or in lust with his brother Henriquez, who is engaged to Lila, who is the wettest drip that ever dripped ever. And there's also the character Zofloya, who is, at this point in the narrative, still alive and an actual servant, a Moorish servant, with a much more dignified history than that. There's a whole other aspect to the novel, which I won't go into today, because it's not related to the dream per se. And there's also, in her dream, there appears a different Zofloya, because later Zofloya is going to die and his place is going to be taken by the devil in his form. So where are we? She's burning with lust for Henriquez. And so she has a dream in which she sees Zofloya, or seems to be Zofloya. But what the dream is actually doing is setting up her deception. It presents her with the devil in Zofloya's form before the devil has physically taken Zofloya's form in real life, arguably. Certainly before she has any inkling of that. So it sets her up to consider Zofloya the possible cure for her problem. Because in the dream, this Zofloya offers a temptation. He offers a promise. If you come to me, I will make sure that they don't get married. And so she's, very happily, she sees the wedding of Lila and Henriquez, and Lila dies. Woohoo! And Berenza dies weltering in his own blood on the floor somehow. And she's like, yes, everything has gone according to plan. And then she sees Henriquez sort of melt into a skeleton in front of her. But she's not forewarned. She's just like, that probably just means we'll be together till we die, I'm sure. So she doesn't take it for the forewarning that it is. So another function of the dream, which makes it perhaps slightly more interesting, is that it offers a forewarning, which creates a complication of her guilt. It makes her more guilty because she's aware of what will happen. She has been warned, she has been told, but she continues anyway, leaping joyfully, gleefully is the term used in the text, into this path of sin, vice, lust, murder, etc. If you're thinking about it theologically, quite an interesting connection there of how the demon is allowed to enter her dream and whether he has divine permission to do so, which this kind of warning idea would suggest that this is divinely sanctioned. Obviously that's not Victoria, but similar vibes. So the other part of this dream and what occurs in it is that the dream doesn't just offer her a temptation. The dream itself is a temptation and becomes itself a form of sin. So Zofloya in that original dream enters her dreams in a noble and majestic form. And as I've already talked about in one of my read-along videos, Kimi and Mikishu suggests that Victoria's real sexual object is Zofloya, who is depicted in increasingly erotic terms. And we're told later on in the novel that he haunted her dreams. Sometimes she wandered with him over beds of flowers, sometimes over craggy rocks. So these dreams become a medium through which she is, not just a medium through which she is tempted, but are themselves a temptation into a different form of sin. So lust, in this case, for the devil himself. Another form of demonic dream is that found in Matthew Lewis the monk. Now bear with me here, because this is where that idea of being verified by the events really comes into play. The dream that Elvira has might appear at first sight to be an angelic dream, but there is danger in misinterpretation because it offers a prophetic warning. She dreams that the evil monk Ambrosio is going to rape her daughter. And so she gets up, she runs into the room, and she gets murdered by her own son, because he's her son. They don't know it, but he is. And eventually she doesn't manage to stop the rape of Antonia at all. So why do I think that this is a demonic dream? Well, verified by the events. It results in her death. And a bit of a spoiler there. It provides no way for her to stop the prophecy. So a divine dream allows the chance for change, for a warning, for action. The demonic prophecy offers none. And then we do have the confirmation at the end. The devil says himself, "It was I who warned Elvira in dreams of your designs upon her daughter." So it was, in fact, very clearly a demonic dream masquerading as an angelic dream. That's why we have to be so very careful. Another instance of the importance of dream interpretation is found in Ambrosio's dream. So after discovering that Rosario is actually Matilda, a woman, he has a dream, a sex dream about... He awoke heated and unrefreshed after a dream about the Madonna that he's been in love with, the painting that he's been lusting after, and Matilda. And he puts a natural interpretation on it. He's sort of like, oh, well, that's the stuff I've been thinking about, so that's why it occurred in my dream. But it's actually a demonic dream. And it's the genesis of his sin. So there's a part at the end where the devil talks about that day as the moment of seduction and the dream as instrumental. So there's this idea that either the dream led to his fall or the sexual congress that he engaged in his dream was a form of dream sin in and of itself. So both readings, I think, are possible. And then we get to the big mystery of Matthew Lewis's The Monk. Lorenzo, right at the beginning, when he sees Antonia, almost before anything happens in the novel, has a dream. He sees his own wedding to Antonia, where an unknown rushed between them, Ambrosio. On his forehead was written in illegible characters, "Pride, lust, inhumanity." The creature goes on to ravage Antonia before being plunged into the gulf, attempting but failing to drag her with him. So that's my summary from a different piece of work I did. But that's what happens in the dream. And it's basically a summary of what happens in the story. Ambrosio does end up doing all of those things, and Antonia does end up escaping into heaven at the end. So is this dream divine? Is it demonic? What's the point of this prophecy? It doesn't seem to be any use. It doesn't seem to be a divine prophecy because it does nothing. It doesn't offer a possibility of escape. And Lorenzo is just like, oh, I'm not thinking about it. Diddly-do-do-do. Probably nothing. But you can also interpret this. So you could marginally interpret it potentially as an angelic dream that he dismisses. But it's prophesying exactly what happens. So there's also the opportunity that it's a demonic dream, producing in and of itself a demonic despair and a sense of inevitability, which produces the inevitability of the action, if that makes sense. So the sense that it's inevitable becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, that you don't stop it because you think you can't. So there's a sense in which it could function very easily as a demonic dream. The last one here, I think, in this section, let me just check, yes, is a demonic dream can be very hard to spot. Sometimes the texts don't give us a nice easy out, as with Elvira, where we're told, oh, it was the devil that did it. Cool. And so I'm going to use one example from the Italian. I've said Radcliffe's all about interpretation. And you have Vivaldi. in the prisons of the Inquisition, and he has a very short dream full of unordered images. But in it, he sees the face of the monk who's been persecuting him. He's been musing on it all day, so it's not an absent object, something he's been thinking about, but he hasn't seen the face before. So the face itself is an absent object. He also sees a dagger unveiled. Nothing is revealed of the future, simply the past. So this could quite easily, all of those criteria fit into what we know about demonic dreams from Salford. So what are the consequences? Well, an unusual dread seized upon him when he woke up. When he woke from the dream and saw standing over him in real life the same monk. A superstition such as he had never before admitted in an equal degree usurped his judgment. Tricksy. My argument is the dream was demonic because it had an effect which was deleterious. Basically, the only effect of the dream was to increase his superstition, increase his fear, and increase his theological error. Meaning that dreams don't have to lie to be demonic. They can be true. So, hopefully I've given you a quick overview of how these supernatural dreams appear. We'll have a quick question time, and then I've just got 3 very short examples of something else to show you before we finish. So, there we go. Any questions? I think it's like the only video I can really see is Mason. It feels like I'm going on this adventure trip around somebody's house. That's cool. Any questions? Any debate about my readings? Do feel free. As usual. Anyone? I can just continue as well. I'll just have a bit of cake. If you want me to like go into more detail on any of the examples, tell me as well, because I'm going through some of them quite quickly because we've read these texts in class before. So I'm not giving full summaries, but I can do if people need them. Have you spotted some recurring images or representations of someone helping with interpretation of dreams? No, not really. There are sort of, occasionally you get this sort of exoticized sort of sense of Romany characters, or Roma, who fulfill a prophetic function using dream symbology, etc. So in the monk you have there's the Song of the Gypsy, so-called, which appears in the story, and that's also prophetic. So you do have occasionally this kind of overlap, but usually with the dream, they're quite self-contained and they're not offered out for interpretation. I think partly because of the wish to avoid the sort of much less respectable idea of dream interpretation through sort of ritualized or formalized symbolic meaning. You do get some of those. I mean, obviously those existed at the time. There were some really, really fun ones. Seeing a black cat, for example, means that you have somebody that you want to persecute unto death for theft. Like, oh, well, apparently I'm very murderous. But in the texts of this period, not so much. No, not really. They don't tend to go and ask anybody. You get that more with ghosts, with the most obvious example being Radcliffe, where people talk to each other and get advice from authority figures. But no, I feel like dreams are usually just more private. Oh, wait, does it happen in Old English Baron? I think, yeah, I mean, in Old English Baron, he discusses what happens with the priest, who is able to confirm that that's very likely. Yeah. No, I mean, I think like angelic or demonic, it's so difficult to interpret them that, I mean, there's not one set way. I think that you do keep finding reoccurring in the writers like Radcliffe and arguably Lewis, this sense that these dreams are essentially uninterpretable before you have some kind of proof. But that's not necessarily going to be for everybody. But yeah, it's tricky. It's definitely tricky to guess them. But yeah, I don't know about sort of people who are experts in dream interpretation, apart from people who are using sort of folkloric or formulaic devices. So it's a bit of a minefield for getting it right. Any other questions just at the moment? I could have just, I think I just waffled a bit, sorry. Okay, let's get into this last bit. Crack. I am doing a couple of the stories, I think. Oh. Yeah. It'd be really interesting to see in different literary traditions, Maeva, like what you're seeing in terms of how dreams appear. And I would certainly say, like, in more modern literature, definitely, you know, just 18th and 19th century, 18th and very early 19th century, less so, perhaps. And in an example that I'm going to show you now, you have people inputting before the dream happens, but not after the dream. So it's an interesting case study. Oh, I didn't even show you my slide. No, appreciate it now. It was quite witty. We'll help you with the nightmares. Let me help you with your nightmare questions. Not very witty. It was late. So the last bit I'm going to talk about is what I consider to be secular dreams, not in the sense of having no theological or supernatural valence, but in that sense I talked about at the beginning. I think what we've seen with those dreams that I've talked about already is that you are seeing different dream systems intertwining, and not sort of a single conception of the dream appearing. What we find, though, particularly in that sort of Romantic period and in the post-19th century or in the 19th century Gothic, is a move towards dreams which engages very directly and openly with the possibility of multiple interpretations. So at the intersection of the Gothic and of the Romance, with all its irony, contingency, and indeterminacy, those are Miles' words, the secularizing tendency begins to come explicitly to the fore of Gothic texts. They openly explore multiple interpretations of the dream, usually occupy a fantastic space of uncertainty, and explore the boundaries of madness, self-deception, and revelation in their representation of dream. So what we usually find in these texts, what we're going to find in the examples I'm giving, is that there's a turn in focus, and the question becomes whether they are real or not. So in those earlier examples I was giving, the question was interpretation of where it was coming from, not whether it was supernatural so much as how to understand it as supernatural. Whereas what we're getting here is this use of the dream and the question about whether it's supernatural or natural and what it reveals is real or not. We're getting that used to question other things, the boundaries of madness and sanity, the boundaries of reality and unreality. So one example is the one that I just mentioned, where she gets lots of input before the dream, is The Dream by Mary Shelley from 1831. And in it, you have a character who is torn. She loves a man from the family that is responsible for her family's death. It's not him, not his fault. But she has basically said, no, I can never marry you out of honor to my parents. And then he pops in with the king. So she can't say no. And the king is like, you should think about marrying him, love. And she's not really interested. Or is she? But she's torn and she says, okay, I'm going to engage with this local folk belief, which is I'm going to go through the woods, up to the cliff, through the cave, down the narrow passageway into an increasingly sublime space. And then I'm going to sleep on St. Catherine's Shelf, which is basically just a thin shelf of rock over a precipice with a roaring river at the bottom. And many people die because they roll off the ledge. But if you stay the night and survive, then you will be gifted with a dream from the divine, is where the theory goes. And this is the dream that she had when she did this. She saw the man that she loved with soiled and tattered garments and unkept locks and wild matted beard. His cheek was worn and thin, his eyes had lost their fire. Her heart then whispers that this was my doing. Upon which a veil fell from her eyes, a darkness was dispelled before her. So she's seeing him basically a prisoner on a crusading expedition. And he's going on the crusades, obviously, because, he's so undone by love. And so she has this dream, and so she realizes suddenly that actually you can't lose your current happiness for the dead. That's ridiculous. So what she does is marry him. But we have this question about whether it is supernatural or not. The idea before she has the dream is represented or questioned as hysterical by a number of different characters. So the king himself says, let's see if this works, those who visit the shelf take the disturbed visions that such uneasy slumber might produce for the dictate of heaven. So he is offering a particular interpretation which says that it's troubled sleep and curious visions that get mistaken for divine revelation. And you also have the narrator chiming in, who says, there is no feeling more awful than that which invades a weak human heart, bent upon gratifying its ungovernable impulses in contradiction to the dictates of conscience. It's quite damning, really, but there's this sense in which the dream, whatever it is, will be a form of self-deception, a deliberate form of self-deception to justify conduct that the character wishes to engage in. So she has this vision which shows her an alternative future. Is this made up? Is this the workings of her own mind in order to serve for wish fulfillment? Well, it's difficult to say. If we hadn't had these interpolations, it would be quite easy to see it very clearly as a potentially prophetic dream. There's a lot of rich detail to it, things that she couldn't perhaps see. It's a realistic prophecy. But more importantly, she has a sort of mental revelation that to make the living happy was not to injure the dead, and how wicked and how vain was that false philosophy which placed virtue and good in hatred and unkindness. So she has this change of perspective produced by the dream, which doesn't really ring in accord with what the narrator's saying in terms of very condemnatory view of this behavior and this revelation. There's also an interesting setup narratively in that these voices offer their disagreement before the dream, but after the dream, nobody speaks but her. She's the only one to have a voice and give testimony at the end of the text. So what I would argue that we find in this text is effectively polyphony. This is the Bakhtinian conception that of a text which has within it independent and unmerged voices or fully valued voices. So there's a difficulty here because of the narratorial intervention. Can they be equal? But I think it's interesting that she is the last one to speak, and her testimony is what finishes the text. So that you have, in a sense, no authorial, no narratorial commentary on the actual dream itself. So it's allowed to stand for itself as another dissonant voice, unmerged with the others. So I think that the text confronts us with the supernatural, and we're asked whether we can believe or whether belief is a trick that we deceive ourselves with, but we're not given an answer by the text. Very reminiscent of Mary Shelley's work on ghosts. Okay, another example, this one I did a read along for this week. Pretty dark one, The Astrologer's Prediction or the Maniac's Fate from 1826. A pretty dark dream, and this one is particularly interested in engaging with the difference, sort of boundaries of madness, insanity, and madness and revelation and the supernatural. You have the main character, Reginald, who is, you know, your stereotypical sort of highly strung, slightly ailing, Byronic-y adjacent anti-hero. When he's young, he meets an astrologer in a tower who's just come to die there. And the astrologer gives him a prophecy and says that, you know, when this star returns, you're going to die here with blood on your hands. So he gives the warning, and he also says, when I die, bury my body. Something that Reginald doesn't do, and it's not quite clear whether if he had buried the body, it would have stopped the prophecy or not, because they're not really connected, but there is a sense that he left it undone. The other characters are his mother, and she's the reason that he returns home, because she sent him away because he was getting sort of sicker and sicker and less connected to reality. And so she sent him away, and he lived abroad for a long time very happily, where he met his wife. But when his mother died, he returned to the ancestral home. And we find this interesting depiction of a dream. One day, he's increasingly descending into madness, but he says, Reginald cannot harm thee, to his wife. And the next day he murders her in a fit of determined madness. So what's happened in between? Well, there was a dream in which angels, demons appeared, and his mother urged him to kill her. And there's this whole narrative, content warning for suicidal ideation here, a whole narrative about death with the mother being better, and that he's doing his wife a favor. So is the dream in this instance an expression of a descent into madness, or is it a catalyst of madness? And what's the connection here with, is what drives him madness, or is there a sense of an inevitable destiny, as predicted by the astrologer, a supernatural element both to the prophecy and thereby perhaps to the dream, figuring it as a demonic dream? So is it an inevitable destiny which he can't escape, or does it become a self-fulfilling prophecy which drives him mad? So you get this sort of very convoluted connection of supernatural interpretations and medicalized interpretations of this dream, which never quite resolve themselves within the text. The last one I'm going to look at is Gothic comedy in the dream, one of my favorite little stories. It's a James Hogg. I read it last night, so if anyone wants to check it out, from 1811, and it's a singular dream. And the basic story is a man goes to another man's house, and the man, he goes to the house of the philosopher A.T. And A.T. is just one of those people who sees everything badly. He's negative about everyone, and he makes everyone out to be sort of hellish and sinful, and the world is this terrible, monstrous place. And there's this heavy streak of irony in the tale where the narrator's like, oh, I was listening to him with bated breath, and then I fell asleep into a reverie, he says. But we have sort of offered various explanations of the dream as we go through, and the story unveils itself. So the first one is, he says, I can't be blamed for what appeared in my dream because you can't control your fancy. So there's this sort of just medicalized explanation, the physical explanation of the dream and why it happened. But then he moves on to a demonic explanation. Why? Because in the dream, he saw a church full of people, and the man, the philosopher A.T., was preaching. And he was preaching all of this stuff against the women of the town. And the church was full of beautiful women, and they were whispering to him, he's the devil. And he looked at Mr. A.T. and he saw him become the devil and then turn into a pig and then come and attack him. And as this was happening, he sort of took a swing and woke up swinging at Mr. A.T. and gave him a proper beating. And when he's leaving the house, he leaves with a friend, and his friend's like, well, I know he was being rough about you, but you shouldn't have beaten him up. And the man says, oh, no, I didn't hear him say anything about me. No, I had a dream about a devil and stuff, and that's why I was beating him up. And the guy says, well, where the devil did that dream come from? He's like, well, the devil, it probably is. So he provides a demonic illustration of this dream as the idea that this dream was caused by the devil in order to punish him or to trick him. Then he moves on to an angelic or divine explanation of the dream, where he says, well, actually, maybe this was a warning dream from God to tell me not to slip into that path of thinking. Maybe this was all a forewarning to me. And then we find out that there's an underlying irony, because why is he talking about this story? Who is he talking about it to? It turns out he is talking about it with the magistrate in order to sort of address this court case against him. And we become suddenly aware of why he might have been talking about how Mr. A.T. was insulting the magistrates. So there's this question opened, not just of how we interpret the dream, but whether the dream was real at all. The existence of the dream comes into question. But we also have this move that I talked about when I talked about the Christmas Carol and the ghosts, this sort of fantastic hesitation which resolves with the solution, it doesn't matter. Because what happened, whether this dream was real or not, was there was a form of epiphany or revelation depicted. And so the dream becomes either allegorical or real, but becomes basically unimportant. But there's this sense in which the dream can arguably produce a revelation, whether it's real or not. So that's my 3 examples of secular dreams. Any questions that you dream of, but think well before you dare to dream. I've got my bibliography, etc. And then all of my quotes. There you go. That's the end. Oh, I'm in time today. Magical. Oh, thanks, Rebecca. I'll see you later. Does anyone have any questions for me? You learned to drive in a dream? Really? I never learned to do anything in a dream. That's really sad. My main dream that I remembered for years and years and years and years was I dreamt that my parents got replaced by doubles who gave me a new toothbrush. And I had worries about that toothbrush and about my parents well into my teenage years, where I'd just suddenly be like, but are they the doubles though? Because it was so realistic. You learn to drive in a dream as well. Maybe the devil's out there teaching people to drive, or, you know, an angel as well. Also a possibility. Yeah, anybody got any questions or any thoughts for me about it? I know I've only gone up to sort of the 1830s, and you get different usages and different appearances in the Romantic period. And then obviously, you know, we've got lots and lots of supernatural dreams in horror films now, which I think would arguably fit into that category of sort of largely divorced from the original theological context. Oh my gosh. This dream stuff, it's all real. I don't think I've ever dreamt a book. I think I've dreamt, like, no, just sadness, just parent doubles. I dream when my mum threw me into a volcano. Yeah, I mean, if there are no more questions, I don't know. I can pop this up again. So I'm just going to pop my Ko-fi up. If you can support, as I say every time, it's totally free. If you can support, then please do. If you can't use Ko-fi for whatever reason, just give me a shout if you're wanting to support me some other way. Yeah, so next week, I can't see if any of you are my Spanish-speaking peeps. I think maybe. But next week is the introduction to the Gothic, so I'm doing more of an overview. I'm stepping out of my time period. I will be doing that next week. And as I said before, the third week in this season is Spanish week, so I'll be giving a lecture in my terrible Spanish. Not terrible, not perfect. Terrible accent from being English and living in Extremadura for too long. But it's going to be very similar overlapping content between the two, because I'm preparing sort of the first week in English, and then I'm going to sort of swap it across into Spanish for the next one. So you're very welcome to either and or both, but it's going to be very similar content. So I might put in like a little bit of an extra something for the Spanish crew, Spanish-speaking crew. I dream as a kid of being in a burger bar. Very realistic and memorable, but quite dull. Yes. Deja vu dreams are the creepiest dreams, aren't they? Especially when they feature... I have this weird thing with dreams and doubles, where, you know, I'm like, I don't think that's my granddad. I remember in the dream he wasn't my granddad, and it really freaks me out. Anyway, thank you very much for coming. I don't know. Yeah, I don't know if the lack of questions is good or bad, but oh no, it's very House of Leaves of you, Mason. The house with extra rooms.
Can I just say something? It's half a question. I'm not sure it's a question, but it's just something on the lecture, really. It was really interesting to see this other theological position on dreams, because I was more familiar with the Catholic one, and especially it's something I've studied and read a bit about, how like in Portugal the foundational myth is a part of it is a battle that was first won in a prophetic dream, and then how that narrative had to keep changing as interpretation of dreams changed. So that was really fun.
I mean, like, there's a whole sort of extra conversation to be had about like how the discussion of biblical dreams generally changed, and the sort of little hoops that got jumped through, and like the wiggle room. You see this kind of theological acrobatics that you see going on, which is always really fun. Because some dreams are, you know, like so pivotal to Christian doctrine that it's really difficult to dismiss the dream without just actually cutting a swath off of the doctrine. Like Peter's dream, for example, about the animals. And you're like, oh, well, if that didn't happen, yeah, sucks to be a Gentile. You're all doomed. So yeah, I mean, if you're needing to leave, do feel free. I'm just reading up on these dreams. Thank you for coming. I'm slightly parental doubles. Maybe they're real though. Still not quite sure about that. It was so real. So real. Anyway, yes, if you want to leave, feel free. I'm just rambling. If you want to say goodbye before you go, feel free. I like to hear people as well. And thank you for coming. It's great to get back to class. It's given me a bit more of a rhythm, even though that rhythm is staying up till 7 on a Friday. Bye. Oh no, 4 hours of dream talk. I think my voice would actually just fall out of my mouth. I'd just be a whisper by the end. No. Did something happen to Maeva, I wonder? Oh, she's still here. Did something happen to you when you walked on the wrong side of the park? I feel like it did, but it probably didn't. I don't know. I wouldn't have done it.
No, actually, nothing happened in the end, but it felt sort of like I was defying everything.
defying the devil. I can imagine. Yeah. No, I just, you know, I'm one of those people who'd survive a horror movie by just being like, no. Nothing to prove for me. I'm a scaredy cat. Off into the breeze. But there you go. Yeah, well, thank you all for coming. I will see you again. Feel free to send requests and stuff. If you're thinking of coming tomorrow, please do. Bronte is ready. She was ready before me for her class tomorrow. Classic times. And yeah, it's going to be really good. So I'm very excited. So hopefully see you there. Bye.
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 Bye, everyone.
Here.